from from what I've been able to tell, you have, I think, maxed out. I don't know, equaled the number of interviews that people who I've seen on TV over the years have conducted. How's that going?
I'm coming up on Larry King level, right? No, I've done well over 100 in 2 weeks.
My goodness. So we have to engage in a discussion about that, and hopefully we can do that tomorrow late in the morning at about 11 o'clock.
Yeah.
We'll have a conversation separate from this discussion of Marx, and we'll talk about that. So I'm looking forward to that. That'll be really neat, very interesting, and we can get at what is, what's happening as far as that goes. So I'm looking forward to that. Matt, today we're going to talk about Chapter 3, Section 1. And the title, of course, is, the title of Chapter 3 is Money, or the Circulation of Commodities. And Section 1 of this particular chapter is called The Measure of Values. One of the things that we discussed in closing last week when we were talking about our talks, Matt, is that we're going to switch it up just a little bit. We're going to begin with practical discussions, and we'll save theoretical discussions about whatever it is that we're addressing from this particular book. We'll save the theoretical discussions for somewhere in the middle of our discussion, somewhere in the middle of the hour. And then, of course, I'm looking forward to any comments that might surface, questions, and hopefully we can then, after this kind of more theoretical discussion, we can engage folks who might post questions, comments, and such. And then we'll close with some poetic presentation of yours to kind of wrap and bring what I like to say in Spanish, dramática to the gramática. Dramática to the gramática. Okay. So I want to tell a story. Actually, it's a story from my family's life, an oral tradition that I think is a good way to get into the artificiality of money and its historical nature. And of course, then we'll have opportunity to talk about the theoretical implications later on. But when I was a kid, of course, I grew up with my grandparents, and my father's mother, lived with us. And my father's mother, and my father as well, my father's, my father's family is from a place in northern Mexico, from the state of Chihuahua, and from a southern portion of the state. The name of the place is Jimenez, Chihuahua. And Jimenez, Chihuahua is noteworthy because it was the hub and the headquarters of Pancho Villa's army. As it turns out, my grandmother was a little girl when Pancho Villa was, in his campaigns, and as my grandmother's stories go or went, and my grandmother, of course, passed away a long time ago, some 30 years ago. But anyway, my grandmother would tell us that Pancho Villa's main headquarters, where he had his military offices, were just across the alley from her home. So she was witness to a lot of things. There's all kinds of stories that I grew up hearing about this particular set of things, but the one particular story that I want to highlight now, or the one anecdote, if you will, that I'd like to highlight now is that my grandmother would share with us that during the revolution, during the Mexican Revolution, when Pancho Villa's army was, victorious, Pancho Villa's the money that Pancho Villa minted had value. It could be used as currency to buy and sell things, as was the case. And when he was defeated, his currency had no value. It was. I remember a story that my grandmother shared one time, and she said that the money, the minted money, the paper money, was used to start the fires in the kitchen. And that always amazed me. That always amazed me. Of course, these were stories that I heard when I was very young, and I was still a child. But I grew up hearing these stories, and such stories always caused me confusion. What was happening outside of the transactions that might have taken place between buyers and sellers that would have some effect on something that in my mind as a child I thought was so stable, so solid, and so neutral and outside of history even. I mean, if you think about it. And so I was very confused by this. Of course, as I got older and I thought about these things, eventually, of course, I think about these things in relation to my readings, my initial readings here on Marx and of Marx on money and the circulation of commodities. But one of the things that I have come to understand then is that there are historical factors, social factors taking place outside of the production of commodities, such that these historical factors bear not just on the price of commodities, not just on the price of a pencil, for instance, but on the value of a pencil, right? And so was the case with this commodity paper, this commodity money that Pancho Villa was minting in the early part of the 20th century during the Mexican Revolution. This gives us an opportunity to talk about some other stuff. I don't know what you might be thinking as far as this is concerned, Matt. I don't know if you have a comparable story or not, but
yeah, I don't know. I could come up with my family's own Pancho Villa stories, but everybody's related. Actually,
yeah, I really have a connection, but we'll talk about that.
No, I believe you. No, I believe my family doesn't actually have a Villa connection. Actually, on my dad's side, supposedly got some connection to the Hidalgo family. So, everybody's connected to somebody that did something important. That's and I don't know how true it is, but it's just kind of
true.
But so reading this, reading this, I say I was reading chapter 3, section 1, and I think I found. I mean, like so much of it, he's talking about gold, and he's talking about this, he's talking about that. He's talking about a lot of things that are kind of like either kind of aren't true anymore, or were just true then, or were never true in the United States because you could just see so much land, and there was so much more value in land.
Yeah.
That make things just slightly different, or I mean, there's obviously England land was more valuable in a different way because there was so little of it, but in the United States, the seizure of more and more land was part of the expansion of the capital, whereas England had a colonial kind of thing. It was different. But what I read here that was really interesting, he says, was this part where he says, in its function as a measure of value, money therefore serves only as an imaginary or ideal capacity. This circumstance has given rise to the wildest theories. But although money that performs the functions of a measure of value is only imaginary, the price depends entirely on the actual substance of money. The value, i.e., the quantity of human labor which is contained in a ton of iron, expressed by the imaginary quantity of the money commodity, which contains the same amount of labor as the iron, right? So what he's saying is that, like, regardless, that the price is going, the value is going to come from the human labor, and that pricing is kind of like, because it's difficult to trace the exact reason why pricing is set a certain way, a certain amount for one thing versus another, there's a tendency to deny the entire human labor's value, because, like, well, you worked 20 hours on that sneaker, or someone worked this many hours on that sneaker, someone worked the exact same amount on that sneaker. Why are Adidas sneakers so much more expensive than Apex sneakers or some knockoff sneaker, right? Why? And so, like, that the question, that there'll be a tendency to do that. But you know, I'm kind of interested in how some of this stuff, like, needs to be updated, because I think that you know, Marx is writing in a time way before, like, these giant marketing firms, way before these things take off into what they are. So we'd have to equate, like, you know, the Madison Avenue stuff as actual human labor being poured into something, right? That there's actually value being extracted from that and being poured into this. So, for instance, like, you know, Marx is writing a time where, like, you know, who are the biggest capitalists in the world? Like John D. Rockefeller, he's Standard Oil. It's called Standard Oil. It's not called, like, whatever. You know, Carnegie's got a brand called U.S. Steel. So these things are not, like, marketed in the same way that Nike or Coca-Cola competes with Pepsi, or, you know what I'm saying? This is a time of monopoly capital where the marketing is not really, it's called Standard Oil. It's not called, like, like Sexy Wednesday oil or something like that. It's not called something like interesting and unique, and, like, it's not Apple, right? Where, like, they catch you off guard with the name that they're saying. So I think that there's definitely a certain question as to why things are priced as they are, versus what is considered to be, like, exchange value or use value. So so how do you put that in, like, everyday language? Well, in everyday language, would be like, the reason why something costs more than something else is not necessarily the fact that it took 10 hours to make this thing versus 10 hours to make that thing, yet this thing costs more, does not disprove the general labor theory of value. What it does is just shows you that someone was a more effective capitalist and was able to achieve a higher rate of profit. You know what I'm saying? Just because, like, you and I are both capitalists and we both make these pens, and I can sell my pen for $1.20, but you can only sell yours for 80 cents, but it costs you 40 cents to make it, and it costs me 40 cents to make it. That does not disprove the labor theory of value. It's like, well, if the labor value was true, then they would both sell their pens for 80 cents because it's a law and it's impossible to not do so. No, I mean, there's still a human factor, still a human element. There's still the ability of individual capitalists to achieve higher rates of profits than other capitalists, because they are simply because they're capitalists and they're better at it. I mean, the same thing that some people can jump higher than other people. I mean, like,
well, there's two things that, up until recently, it was unclear to me what the price of something meant, right? I knew, for instance, of course, it's we know, for instance, that there are discussions of supply and demand. That the greater the supply of something and the lower the demand of something, right? That the combination of these two things is going to, drop the price of a particular commodity, a pencil, a pen, oil, and there's opportunity for discussion as well, right? And so that the laws of supply and demand have a bearing on price. And what we're learning in this particular section of this particular chapter, right, that there's this law in existence at the same time that an opposite law, if you will, is in existence. And the opposite law is that, in fact, price represents value. That if this pencil, that if it costs, that if it costs, I don't know, if it costs, 10 cents to produce this particular pencil, right? That is representative of the labor time involved and the coordination of the economy, such that this pencil is representative of the value that was coordinated in its production. So that there's this tension, right? On the one hand, there's as far as this commodity is concerned, and as far as the capitalists who produce it are concerned, right? One seeks to give it a price that is indicative of its value, or there are people in society seeking to give this particular commodity a price that is indicative of its value, and then there are people in society that are working to give it a different price, to inflate it of a price, or conversely, to deflate it such that its management is in the interest of the people seeking to manipulate this particular commodity. And I was thinking about this. Because how might we come to understand our lives, commoditized as our lives are, when we are not the ones setting the price, and for that matter, when our value is determined by forces outside of us. Mm-hmm. So that's one question that I've been contemplating, and I suppose it's a bit of an abstract question, right? So then I thought about another question that I might bring to our conversation, Matt. What about those commodities? What about those commodities that we have harnessed, particularly those commodities that we have harnessed as a community of people, as Chicana and Chicano people? What does the gamble around those particular commodities say about our existence? Land as a commodity, to which, as a commodity that we consume to the extent that we can. That's one commodity. Another one for me, one of course, as you know, and those of us who have those in the audience that have been following us know, I'm an educator, right? So there's this other commodity, and the commodity is called education. And so if land is a commodity, and there's this tension between, there's this tension where some seek to give land a particular price that is not indicative of its value, or if there's this commodity called education and some seek to give it a price that is not indicative of its value, what does that say about us? What does it say about us as Chicana and Chicano people who possess or seek to possess this commodity, seek to have an education? It's as if we are seeking to play a game, and I'm thinking about a basketball game, right? Where we are seeking to play a game, seeking to handle a basketball in a particular court whose exchanges and dribbling, etc., is perpetually beyond our reach. In a sense, we get played by the game as much as the ball gets played in the game. I hope I haven't gotten too abstract. It's just that,
Yeah.
I wonder how we might talk about these things in tangible ways. Things that
I think the tangibly, to really speak of the tangibly, it's like who does what jobs, right?
Yeah.
Like, there's all these different stations in the economy, but who does what jobs? And when I think about what you're talking about, I think about like historically this question of like people that work in the parts of the economy that deal with extraction, that deal with like pulling things out of the natural earth, to be later shipped off and be manufactured somewhere else, right? And those people within that, they're never the intent. See, like we live in this worker consumer economy, but they were never intended as the consumer paying the full price for consumption. What they end up doing is getting locked into like systems of debt peonage, like almost all over the world. That's the most common thing, with the exception of like chattel slavery, which is just like even worse. I mean, like that's an even worse level of exploitation, right? But if it's not chattel slavery, it's usually going to be some level of debt peonage. You see it with sharecroppers, you saw it with coal miners, you see it with itinerant farmers. You see, I mean, it's all kinds of just different situations, where it's always they do is they lock people into this kind of like company town, right? So you're in like this kind of company town section of the capitalist enterprise, right? When you're in the company town section there, you're not really meant to pay the full price for the Nike. You're not really the consumption base. The consumption base is in the urban center, right? So that kind of extractive part of the economy is where historically the Chicanos, in a way, because the Chicanos, who are the Chicanos? They're the people that are affected by the Mexican-American War, suddenly American, as well as Mexican simultaneously, right? That's who they are, right? For lack of a better term, that's just, I mean, for not getting into all the spiritual stuff, I mean, materially, economically, that's who we are. We are a group of people who were Mexican, then became American, and then we're the descendants of those people. So in those situations, we begin our economic station in this country by being displaced from land, by being proletarianized, and being lynched, murdered, killed. I mean, it's horrific the way the process which it happens. But after that happens, now we become mostly initially in what will be the extractive economy. Later, there's like this rural to urban migration, in which now there's way more of us in cities than in rural areas. But when we come into cities, we end up in what's called like service section of economy, right? So now we're like washing dishes, we're maids, we're janitors, we're this. I mean, and this is not everybody, but this is like the majority of people. So then from there we get this question of education. So because the question of education is supposed to pull you out of the extractive economy, it's supposed to pull you out of this extractive section of the economy, it's supposed to pull you out of the service section of the economy.
At least that's the story that we're told. I'm sorry, go ahead.
That's the story that's told, and as individuals, some people are able to do so. It's a small percentage of the population. It's when I say small, it's not totally small, but it's not over 50%, right? It's much less than 50%. It's much less than half of the community, so it's definitely a minority. So some people are able to do that, but not everybody, and not most people. So that's kind of where the question of education as a commodity kind of comes in, because it's supposed to pull you out of those jobs and into these jobs. Now, even if you make it into these jobs, you're still going to suffer a bunch of like psychic abuse in those jobs. In fact, you might in a way suffer more psychic abuse in those jobs for being in those jobs when you're supposed to be in those jobs over there, right? But the quality of your life will materially improve because you're going to get paid more. Like you may not get paid what your white colleagues are, your Anglo colleagues. You may not make that money, but you are going to make more than those jobs, right? So your life is materially improved, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You respond to it as you respond to it. But that is the draw and idea of education, that you may be one of those people that happens. Now that is describing, but see, Marx is describing an economy that exists in the 1800s, and that idea of education is going to push you forward is describing an economy that existed in the 1970s. This economy that we're talking about does not really exist as much anymore. Yeah. So you have to be amongst the even fewer percentile of people to be able to say, okay, I got this education and now I can do this. Because what's much more likely to happen is that you're still going to end up in the service economy, but you're going to have $150,000 of debt. That's what's much more likely to happen in our current moment. Yeah. Because unless you're like well connected, you know how to speak to, unless you're just better at hustling, than other people. The guarantee of this thing is not going to move in the way it is. Now that doesn't mean there aren't still spots. It just means there's much fewer spots, and those spots are getting fewer and fewer and fewer and fewer. Because again, just as pricing of a pen doesn't mean that value doesn't exist. Just because somebody is able to make it this thing doesn't mean it's diminishing. The block of ice, in a sea that you're standing upon isn't shrinking, is not melting, right? That block of ice is melting. It's an ever melting block of ice. Yeah. But just because a couple people get through doesn't mean the block of ice is melting. So when I look at this, I see today that this kind of like urban center consumption base itself is shrinking and shrinking and shrinking and becoming more and more like the company town, right? Because the company town was never designed to be the base of consumption. That was never supposed to be. This is what will sell all our products directly back to these particular people working this. No, it's meant to be sold back to the workers in the city, right? Whose lives, as precarious and horrible as they are still better than the workers in the fields, right? And so this is why we as Chicanos were prohibited from entering into urban center union type jobs. For so many years, it was such a struggle to get into these unions. It was such a struggle to get into these jobs. It was such a struggle for us to even integrate into positions held by working class white people, who are also being exploited, who are also having value torn out of them and money made off of them. And we fought to just get to that level of having that amount of value extracted from us, as opposed to this amount of value extracting from us. And that defines so much of our struggle in education.
You made reference to the word precarity.
Mm-hmm.
You made reference to the word precarity, and I'd like to address it a bit here. You also make reference to the fact that the world, the historical moment, the economic context in which Marx was writing in the 1800s, though still in existence, has taken a variety of turns that are much different than the kind of capitalism that Marx knew about in the 1800s. Now there is, as it were, sexy Wednesday oil, right?
Yeah.
Today. That exists. It didn't exist back then, right?
Right. It was Standard Oil.
Or exactly. Back then it was Standard Oil. Now it's sexy Wednesday oil, right?
I'm not to interrupt you, but just think about how basic that is.
Yeah.
Standard Oil.
Yeah.
I mean, all the commodities back then were basically basic shit. Like that was wrong. That was.
So something else has happened in addition to that kind of transformation. Gold is no longer the point of reference.
Right.
So these, this discussion that's taking place in this particular section, in this particular chapter 3 of Capital, right, is useful for understanding an economy that has gold as its principal point of reference.
Mm-hmm.
But gold has ceased to be the principal reference for the international economy now, going now on about 50 years. Now, what has happened as a consequence of this is that, as I understand, right, the U.S. dollar becomes the principal point of reference, and that really gives the U.S. economy an advantage in the face of other economies around the globe.
Yeah.
And I want to talk about something because it seems as if we might talk about, it seems as if now that the kind of precarity, the vulnerability that created as far as other economies are concerned over the last 50 years seems to have been extended, to put it mildly, exaggerated perhaps, to make a fair statement, right? That the current moment, the viral moment, has brought that precarity to us here in even more extended and exaggerated fashion. Now we are experiencing, now we know the world that, and the economy that folks in other parts of the world know. And now we're put in a position where we can't even walk outside of our homes with any degree of security. And that gives the folks that are running the game, in this case, our lives, frankly, our health on the surface, that puts them at an advantage. We are, in a sense, living today what folks in other parts of the world over the last 50 years have experienced when gold was removed as the standard. You know, the plummeting of the Mexican economy in the late 70s, early 80s, for instance, which is the main reasons why so many Mexican people have come, particularly to LA over the last 30, 40 years, is on account of the kind of economic precarity that folks in Mexico were living. So we here in LA, Americans, as you know, as we are living a crisis not unknown to folks outside of the United States.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the first thing I would say though is, you know, like this is kind of what we're reading here in Capital is kind of like it's very verbose, and I think a lot of stuff he covers here, he covered in a much easier to understand, much easier to understand in a value, price, and profit, right? So that was definitely like way easier to like read, and I think that, you know, with Capital, he was really trying to say what he exactly meant and all the nuanced details in which he exactly meant it. In value, price, and profit, it's a lot of it's kind of excerpts from his speeches and debates, and so he's trying to make his point. He's trying to discredit other people, and oftentimes Marx is trying to discredit other people. He's much more legible, right? So it's much easier to read when he's fighting with people, right? Because he wants to be understood, and he wants to humiliate somebody. He wants to make sure that they're discredited, and so it's like a lot easier to understand when he's discrediting somebody. He's like, oh, okay, I get it. And so, like, I see what you're trying to say. So I think value, price, and profit is actually a much easier read than chapter 3, section 1. But I will say that what I will say though is that there needs to be, and there's no shortcoming on his part, there just needs to be an updating of value, price, and profit, because he's writing at a time when, I mean, the biggest capitalist industries, at least in the United States of America, are called Pittsburgh Carnegie Steel Company, New York Central Railroad, that's Carnegie, Standard Oil, Rockefeller, and later when Morgan buys the Pittsburgh Steel Carnegie Company, he renames it to U.S. Steel. Again, none of this is all pre-Madison Avenue. This is all pre mass marketing. This is pre, you know, there's a reason why certain commodities are sold for just so much higher prices than other commodities. And it's, you know what I'm saying? Like Carnegie, Rockefeller, they weren't. Of course, you know, of course, like who are they selling to, right? So you know, like Carnegie's not selling his steel to the average working man, right? He's selling it to other industrial capitalists. So he's a little different, but you know, like, but Standard Oil was sold, you know, to you know, to the large capitalist enterprises, but it was also just sold to just people, like you know, lighting their kerosene. So, you know, the need to distinguish yourself on a capitalist market was not as highly developed as it would be into the world I was born into, the world you were born into, the world even my mother was born into, and even my grandpa was born into. Like, by that point in time, there was by the time like Henry Ford does what he does, there becomes this thing where you must distinguish yourself amongst other capitalists in order to sell your product, right? The need for distinguishment, not just monopoly, not just the ability to produce, not just the workers to do it, not just that, but the need to distinguish yourself upon a market of things, a market of commodities, a flood of commodities. That's different. And I think that particularly when we're getting out of leaving Fordism into this weird digital age of commodities, into the digital commodity, now we're really getting into marketing. Now we're really getting into like these weird little distinctions that make make some, like for instance, let's take like, okay, like you and I have a cat, right? And YouTube's going to pay us if we can get enough views of our cats, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And for some reason, my cat can burp, right? A song, right? I'm going to make a whole lot of money with this cat that can burp a song, but I didn't put any more work than you did, like setting up your camera, etc. Right? But I'm going to make some more money because I got this weird little fetishistic thing that people want to see. This cat can burp.
Greater price than my cat. Same
Exactly.
Same value.
I feed the cat the same thing. I did, but like who knows? So that kind of thing, I don't think is described in Marx. Like, you know, like who can like better sell their cute cat tricks on YouTube.
Yeah.
So what I mean to say, and again, it's no fault of his. It just needs updating. I mean, that is what I would say, particularly about this chapter we're reading, and also the collection it most closely resembles, which is price, value, and labor.
Yeah, yeah. So there's one quote in this particular section that receives a lot of attention, and to be true to that tradition, I'd like to draw some attention on it, and so that we might discuss what is conveyed and communicated here, metaphorically even, and. It reads, "The name of a thing is something distinct from its qualities of that, or from the qualities of that thing. I know nothing of a man by knowing that his name is Jacob. In the same way with regard to money, every trace of a value relation disappears in the names pound, dollar, franc, ducat, etc. The confusion caused by attributing a hidden meaning to these Kabbalistic signs is all the greater because these money names express both the values of commodities and at the same time aliquot parts, equal divisions, fractions, aliquot parts of the weight of the metal that is the standard of money."
Is aliquot like allocate, but like spelled differently or something?
Aliquot is like, I forget what words we used when I was a kid in grade school, but aliquot is like 5 is an aliquot of 15. 6 is not an aliquot of 15. I mean, you know, there's not there's not an equal number of sixes in the number 15, but there is an equal number of 5s in the number 15. Does that make sense? I forget what we used in grades.
That means nothing to me, but I'll go with it. I'll let you handle that.
Aliquot means
aliquotion.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is 19th century English, and we're not talking. But perhaps economists are still using this language. I don't know. I'm not a sociologist of the economy, so who knows? Maybe this word is still in use. In any case, what I'd like to underscore here is, by way of this particular quote, is something that you were talking about just a few moments ago, and that is that number one, we don't know the value contained in something simply, we don't know all that is contained in a particular commodity without. We don't know all that is contained in a particular commodity if we only use its surface as the point of reference for understanding this particular commodity. And by surface, in this case, I don't mean the color of the pen, for instance. What I mean is the price that is given to a particular pen, right? And so by way of this chemistry, if you will, by way of this economic chemistry, by way of identifying the tensions, the historical tensions that exist in the production of a commodity on the one hand, and the attempt to harness those tensions in the interest of particular sectors of society on the other hand, it's by way of knowing these things that we come to understand what the significance of a particular commodity or a set of commodities is in a society that is built on the basis of the commodities that it
yeah, in a world of commodities. I mean, commodities related, commodities in relation, in a sea of commodities, commodities crashing into one another.
Exactly, exactly. And so this for me is a very interesting, kind of science.
Yeah.
And it explains for me, or rather, it gives me the initial ground, the initial platform on which to with which to approach not just the commodities that we consume, land, for instance, or the commodities from which we are kept from consuming, but it gives me an opportunity to understand our commoditization and thus our price, our commoditization and thus our value in a particular society. So I'm interested, if I, and I think that this is a particular value in this particular book, and this is a particular value of this book for folks doing Chicana and Chicano studies, for folks in Chicana and Chicano higher education, for instance, that if we are to understand ourselves as a community of people, and if we are to understand ourselves as commoditized workers, in the Central Valley, for instance, or if we are to understand ourselves as commoditized workers in the sports and entertainment and hospitality industry, which is one of the top industries in the LA metropolitan region. If we are to understand ourselves as workers, we ought to understand then, what the forces are outside of us that are bearing on how it is we are played, when we are the object of other people, and we are that ball on the basketball court.
Well, yeah. Like I think that, that's, of course. I mean, like, I remember seeing the film Rocky Balboa, and Rocky gives a speech to his son. And is basically like, like you got to keep getting up, and that's how winning is done, right? It's very famous, right? But then he says, like, like if you think you got more value, go get what you're worth, right? And so this question of like going out and getting more value, meaning you deserve to get more money, right? It is interesting because he's saying go out and get what you're worth. And we have this concept of like, hey, I'm worth more than this. I'm worth more than that. I'm worth more. But we don't even understand the fact that when we're saying this, what we're saying is that we need to get a higher salary. But the point is, even if you do get a higher salary, there is still a mathematical equation that you are subjecting yourself to where you will never get what you're worth. This economy cannot function on you getting what you're worth. This economy cannot function on you getting what you produce, ever. Not just for us, not anybody. Nobody can get what they produce. Nobody can get what they produce. They either have to produce nothing and get everything like the capitalist, or they produce everything and get less and give it to the capitalist. That's the only way that is the setup, the basic setup of this economy. And that's true of every ethnicity, right? Now within that thing, there are these different groups, these different quote unquote ethnic groups, these different racial groups, right? But those aren't just groups that just, like you said earlier, I know nothing of a man because his name is Jacob. Okay, I know nothing of these people simply because they are called Mexicans. This is our position does not emerge from our diet, our culture, our language, our whatever. It emerges from our historical position based on the result of fucking war, of conquest, of murder, of pillage, of organized brutality. That is where our position emerges from. And that is why we are the lowest paid workers, or amongst the lowest paid workers. That is why we are the scapegoats. That is why we are a group of people who are constantly, abused and insulted and degraded in this country because of a result of warfare, as a result of murder and conquest and pillaging and later social positioning. Not because of anything that is inherent to us, not because of anything we produce culturally, not because of any kind of for any other reason other than that. That is why we are where we're at. And so I think that when we have to understand, like when we go to sell our labor is diminished. Our ability, our labor is demanded and diminished simultaneously. When we go to speak for our conditions, we are silenced, because to hear of our conditions challenges the general notion of what this country is, even demographically. So that is why we find ourselves in the position we find ourselves, that we are not that we have silence added to injury in this country. We have questions though, and we have comments, even though you can't see them here.
Oh, okay. I don't see any, so let's see.
Right. I didn't set it up right at first, so we got like a bunch of people saying things. if you want to address that, or if you want to just keep talking.
No. I mean, the only reason that I kept talking and I haven't said hi to anybody is because I haven't seen the names on the sidebar here of my.
Right. Well, I can read them to you off my phone, because what happened was, so for everyone who's been commenting, what has happened is that I had to click from friends only to public, and because when you do that, you can't see it on the service we're using. So I can't even see it on my Facebook page on the laptop. I have to pull my phone out and see the whole comment section. But so we have a question from Gilbert Belmontes. He says, Cubo, as the empire crumbles, will capitalism crumble?
Do you want to take that, or I'm happy to take a stab at that, but I don't know if you're interested in.
Okay, sure. I'll go. I think as the empire crumbles, will capitalism crumble? I think capitalism's already kind of crumbling, in terms of its old industrial form, in terms of the way it was set. The capitalism Karl Marx is describing is crumbling, and it has been crumbling. It's been crumbling my entire life, and whether it'll be replaced by something good or something even worse is open to political struggle.
Well, there's this. I think it's a good question, because as far as I've been following a discussion on the economy, there's two discussions, somewhat in the line or in the vein of something you just said, right? Capitalism is not going to crumble. Capitalism is going to return to the kind of capitalism that folks in 19th century England knew about, the kind of hyper exploitation that existed at that point is on the horizon. That's one line of thinking, and we'll talk about this to the extent that we have time to do so. But then there's another discussion in keeping, if you will, though on an opposite side of this particular discussion, and that is that capitalism is in fact crumbling, that we are at the advent of a new historical moment, that society is going to blow the lid off of the capitalist pot, and that we begin to see rumblings of the lid, if you will, today. And of course, folks that are framing the historical moment in this particular way draw our attention to the kind of things that have happened in France over the last year, kind of things that have happened in South America over the last year and a half, in Mexico, and even going back to the Occupy movement some 10 years ago or so. And even before that, if you want to go back 20 years, right, drawing our attention to the kind of things that were happening in Seattle. That there are these things that the contemporary neoliberal economy has occasioned, that where the capitalist class has moved further to the right, that there are instances of social agents, historical agents on the planet that are seeking to turn history further to the left. I don't know what is in store in 5 years' time. hell, I don't even know what's in store for me tomorrow, to be quite honest with you. So I don't have a particular stand. I don't have a particular take on this, at least not yet. What do you think, Matt?
Well, I think what you're describing is that people oftentimes think they're going to have like capitalism or socialism, right?
Yeah.
And what I'm talking about is like capitalism being wiped off the board in the same way feudalism was wiped off the board. I'm not talking, and also socialism being wiped off the board. And we're going to have either like a highly technological kind of communist world society economy kind of thing, or we're going to die. And that's it. That's it. So I mean, like, so there's because look, a water wheel will produce a certain type of society. A steam engine will produce a certain type of society. A manufacturing line will produce a certain type of society. The microchip produces a different type of society. What type of society that is, I don't know, but we've been finding out for the last 40 years, right? And so this next 20, 30 years is going to tell us, right? And what it's showing is more and more and more that work can be automated. There's all this kind of stuff can be automated. If you have that, you can't have a worker-consumer economy. You can't. If you don't have workers, you can't have a worker-consumer economy. So I think that a lot of what's going on with this UBI movement that's coming out of the Silicon Valley is a way to protect the market outside of capitalist relationships, outside of the worker-consumer model, right? So I'm going to give you free money so you can buy my stuff so the owners of intellectual property can remain billionaires and still live lives you can't. And maybe I'll hire you as sex slaves or something. You know, like I'll hire you for my amusement outside of that. But, you know, you will still give me money and you'll sit there amused and entertained because you get this free money and you will buy my apps, right? And so that's kind of, maybe that's the way of the future. I don't know. But what was is not going to be.
Yeah.
And that's the most constant thing of history. Whatever was will no longer be.
In moments such as ours.
In any moment, in every moment, there's no moment that lasts. The 1920s don't last. The 1930s don't last. The 1940s don't last.
Never as visibly for the layperson, if you will, as the last.
Oh my God! All right, so I think the COVID crisis is revealing how much of this market system is just really just you have no guarantees in life. And all your ideas about bootstraps and he who shall not work shall not eat and all those things that we believe in and we push and do to one another, and particularly in the Chicano community. I mean, like, you know, that you talk about colonization, you talk about, you know, like the gringos, the Anglos doing this and that, but within the Mexican community, this idea that, like, you know, if you don't work, you don't deserve things, you don't. Whatever, that's internal. I mean, that so much of that's internal, and you could describe what the origin of it is or what it is, but that's not coming from the outside. That's coming from the inside. We do that to one another. We do that to one another. We make crazy demands of one another, not to just sit around and be lazy and just smack on that. You know, and this COVID crisis is really showing like that. That's not. I mean, even as I say this now, I say like, well, but we do got to work. We got to work for the revolution, right? But like, there's a part of me that's like, what the hell am I saying? Like, stop it. You know, like, and I got like 5 more interviews like after this. You know, like, what are you talking about, man? But no, but we do that to each other, and we do it, and it's not good because when it's in the good name of we're working towards our own exploitation under these conditions, and we're making and we're making it a point of pride. We're making it a point of pride, and that's not good. That's not good, and that needs to change, and that needs to be challenged, and then that needs to be. We need to work that out.
Hey, can you share with us, please, the names of some of the folks that have either since I don't know who the folks are, Matt. Just, you know, maybe a shout out to a few people whose names you see on your computer screen.
Oh, I'm seeing it on my phone, but. So we got George Jorge Garcia.
Oh yes,
and he's making comments about our pens, about our pen metaphor. Always with the pen.
Fancy pencil.
Our pens and pencils. Zahn, of course, is commenting. He's talking about. He's asking us to consider the work of Mauricio Lazzarato, and the making of the indebted man. So that's maybe something we can look into.
Yeah, absolutely.
He says the generalization of property as commodities has escaped. It can always be deductive. Something always escapes. Chicanos are full of escapes. Dust James joins us. He says, glad to get part of this Glad to have caught part of this live, powerful discussion on imperialist hegemony. Zahn brings up the Bitcoin. Like now we have Bitcoin. So that's
what I was discussing.
that's a whole other level.
Yeah.
Gary Rodrigo joins us. He says, here we have the human body as part of the machine. What backs that dollar? The ability to create a war machine. Yes, the infancy of the Bitcoin is getting traction. So we're talking about the Bitcoin. Let's remember the argument still stands for the fight for sovereignty and human meaning, says Gary Rodrigo. Zahn says production for utility's sake is a production for. So there's a whole like conversation here, like independent of you and I.
That's great, you know, because we're trying to create community here. So I'm pleased about that.
Okay. So maybe we can participate in the Gary and Zahn conversation as equal participants at a later time, because they go on for about 15 comments talking to one another, which is great. But they're debating Bitcoin, which maybe we should have as well. But
hey, we're at the closing end.
Yeah,
we're at the closing. We're at the closing.
I know.
Won't you share some gramatica for the gramatica?
I feel like I should like have like some slippers or something to put on, like, and like have like a little sweater, like Mr. Rogers, like just like let us know the hour has closed and the time is come. All right. Okay. So like you keep mentioning this. I sometimes think you're like sending me cues that you want me to read, but I'll do this one because it has to do with who gets played. Who knows, man? Who knows where it really began, where the time goes, where the money went, who runs the board, who gets played. See, I'm Mexican, American, Chicano, U.S. born and raised. You know how the story begins. How else but with once upon I go back to Mexico, must have about 5 or 6. Sometimes these things happen a little sooner than expected. Sorry, kid. That's the way it is. Seems like you're gonna have to make a decision. Think quick, don't flinch. Thumbs out, punch fist now, forever. Hold your tongue. See, I was born 81, which makes me young Gen X or old millennial. Shit, I don't know. Sometimes seems like my birthright is more questions than answers. What I do know is this: something terrible happened around 489 years before I was born in my life. Well, it just hasn't been the same since. See, what you call microaggressions, I call mini conquests by the water cooler. See them sailing in my mind, just like Hernan Cortez, John Smith. Chest plates and muskets, shoe buckles and loaded questions, office eugenics, pointed statements like, when Polk took Mexico City, you should take the whole thing, or all legals are diseased, you were born here, so why are you offended? If I act like I did when I was a kid, shit, you already know what would happen, but I never wanted to repent or confess because I was not born to be forgiven. Not here, not now, not by them. So I'm man for president. So I saw a man for president and heard a rainbow coalition of friends debate what they call Mexicans, drug dealers, and rapists was racist or populist. Demand discussion or reflection and some nuance. Why couldn't I feel the pain of people felt nothing but hate for mine? All I could do was reflect upon my life and ask myself why. Because sometimes it seems like the more I think, the less I know. And the more I speak, the worse it gets. Even ready to fight, we don't know what the hell we're talking about. Our mouths just running, muttering, something about a nation of immigrants. Always trying to make sense of our lives using images not our own, some secondhand bootleg history written for us to serve them. Because the real power lies not in the pursuit of the answer, but in the posing of the question. Sometimes it seems like someone's always trying to convince me of something. Like the things they don't want us to see. Like they're manipulating reality. Some nights I drive the city, I see nothing but brown faces. Go back inside, turn on television. I don't see them talk loud again. It's like we're here, but we're not. Like they want to blame us and not allow a response. Like no part of this culture is ours. Like perpetually foreign, like an apartheid state of mind where they capture the imagination to prevent the future from being born. It's like the Mexican-American War never ended. Every billboard in the city of Los Angeles screaming out some white savior shrouded in penance or revolt, but everybody knows. Everybody knows. Jesus. Joker. Both of them are Mexican. Everybody knows how the story ends, America. What do you get? What do you get when you steal half a nation, then oppress its descendants? I'll tell you what you get. You get what you fucking deserve.
What's up with that? All right, man. Well, thank you, Matt. I want to thank the audience for engaging us and engaging one another. I am interested, at least by way of our exchanges here, to contribute to the kind of questions that Matt is talking about in his poem. Matt?
It's great. Yeah, man. Yeah, you know, I'm gonna say my little thing, but it's kind of funny. Like, talk about invisible commodities. I keep feeling I have my glasses on my face, and I keep like pulling this Orrin Hatch thing where I'm gonna like. All right, I gotta find those. All right. Just remember, just because we're locked in doesn't mean we have to be locked out. Physical distance, not social distance.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Appreciate it.